All right, we're about to dive into a theory that's so radical, it might just change how you think about, well, thinking. We're exploring Julian Jaynes's The Origin of Consciousness, and trust me, it's a wild ride into the very nature of our own minds.
But first, let me ask you something. That voice inside your head? Yeah, that one. The narrator who's probably commenting on what I'm saying right now. Where did it come from? Have we always had it? According to Julian Jaynes, the answer is a hard no. And that's where things get really interesting.
So, to really get what Jaynes was proposing, you have to understand just how revolutionary his idea was. He wasn't just suggesting a small tweak to our understanding of the mind. Nope. He was trying to rewrite the entire history of human thought from the ground up.
And this right here is the heart of the conflict. Most of us just assume consciousness as biological hardware. You're born with a brain, therefore you're conscious. Simple. But Jaynes completely flips that on its head. He says it's not hardware at all, it's software, a linguistic program that we only installed a few thousand years ago. Before that, our minds were running on a completely different operating system. For Jaynes, our whole idea of consciousness is built on metaphors. We talk about an inner space where a little metaphorical I lives and thinks. He argued that language gave us the tools to build this inner world, but for most of human history, that's not what language was for at all.
I love this analogy because it hits the nail on the head. We tend to think our consciousness is like a giant floodlight, illuminating everything in our minds at once. Jaynes said, no way. It's more like a tiny flashlight in a massive dark warehouse. It only lights up one little thing at a time, while almost everything your brain does, from breathing to understanding my words, is happening completely automatically in the dark.
Okay, so if ancient humans weren't conscious like we are, how did they get anything done? How did they build pyramids or write epics? This brings us to the core of Jaynes's absolutely fascinating theory, the bicameral mind.
The bicameral mind, literally a mind of two chambers. Jaynes proposed that until about 3,000 years ago, humans didn't introspect. When they were faced with a stressful or new situation, they didn't sit down and weigh the pros and cons. Instead, they heard a voice, an auditory hallucination telling them exactly what to do. And they didn't think it was their own thought. They thought it was the voice of a god or a dead king.
He even pinned this to our brain's anatomy. The theory goes that the right hemisphere, the God part, would generate the command, and the left hemisphere, the mortal part, would simply hear it and obey. No questioning, no self-awareness, just obedience. Can you even imagine navigating your life by listening to what you thought was an external voice, but was actually coming from inside your own skull?
Obviously, that's not how our minds work today for the most part. So what happened? According to Jaynes, this God-haunted system broke down, and it was in the rubble of that collapse that modern, subjective consciousness was born.
Jaynes laid out this whole historical timeline. For thousands of years, these bicameral civilizations were doing just fine, guided by their divine voices. But around 1000 BCE, society got complicated. You had massive cities, writing, trade between different cultures. The simple command, plant the corn, wasn't enough to navigate this new complex world. The old mental model started to crack, and the gods began to fall silent.
One of his most compelling pieces of evidence comes from ancient literature. If you read Homer's Iliad through Jaynes' eyes, it's wild. The characters don't really have an inner life. They don't agonize over decisions. When the hero Achilles gets angry, a god literally appears and tells him what to do. Every action is prompted by one of these external voices, not by some internal, personal will.
So here's the crucial turning point. As those hallucinatory voices faded, humanity was in a crisis. How do we make decisions? The answer, Jaynes argued, was that we took language, which used to be the medium for divine commands, and we turned it inward. We learned to talk to ourselves, creating that narrative inner space, that metaphorical I. For Jaynes, this was the moment consciousness as we know it was born.
Now, Jaynes didn't think this ancient mentality just vanished completely. He saw its echoes all around us in the modern world. But as you can imagine, a theory this grand attracted a lot of criticism. He pointed to things like hypnosis, where a person's will seems to be handed over to an external voice as a remnant of this older mind. He even suggested that the auditory hallucinations experienced in schizophrenia might not be a dysfunction, but a kind of throwback, a vestige of this once universal bicameral state.
However, the critics came out swinging. The first big issue is the neuroscience. Jaynes basically described the brain as two separate people, a god giving orders and a mortal obeying them. Modern neurologists would say that's a massive oversimplification. The brain is an incredibly complex and integrated network, not this simple two-part story. And that leads us to the biggest hurdle for the whole theory. There's a lack of hard, definitive proof. You can't put a 3,000-year-old brain in an fMRI scanner. There's no fossil record of thought. So as incredible as the idea is, it remains a hypothesis, a fascinating what-if that science can't really confirm or deny.
The second major criticism is a little more meta. Jaynes argues that our consciousness is built from metaphors, but his critics point out that his entire theory is also built on metaphors. You can see how that creates a kind of intellectual quicksand. Look, metaphors are amazing tools for explaining things, but can you build a solid scientific theory on them? Critics argue that this reliance on ambiguity makes the whole structure beautiful, but also kind of unstable. It's hard to test rigorously, which is a big problem for a scientific thesis.
So, if it's speculative, if it's criticized for its lack of hard evidence, why are we still talking about it decades later? Why does this idea refuse to go away?
Well, I think the answer is in the sheer power and audacity of the questions Jaynes asked. His work is this monumental thought experiment. He pulled from history, literature, psychology, neurology. He pulled it all together to create this framework that forces us to look at our own minds not as a biological given, but as a historical artifact.
And ultimately, the enduring value of Jaynes's theory isn't whether he was right or wrong about every little detail. Its real power is in its provocation. It shakes our most fundamental assumptions and opens up totally new ways to think about the most mysterious thing in the universe, our own consciousness.
So I'll just leave you with this final thought to chew on. That voice inside your head, that sense of you that seems so solid, so eternal, what if it's not? What if your entire subjective reality is a relatively new, fragile invention of language and history? What would that mean for who we are?